Good morning. Welcome everyone to the annual Thinking Spatially Symposium. This year we are focused on Indigenous mapping. My name is Bianca Castellanos and I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And for those of you joining us online, I'm a brown-skinned woman with dark hair wearing glasses with black frames and a white jacket. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from ancestral and contemporary lands of Dakota people. The Morrill Act enabled the establishment and endowment of 52 land-grant, land-grab universities, including the University of Minnesota, via the sale of 11 million acres. The United States took that land through 162 treaties of seizures, resulting in the dispossession of nearly 250 nations. Since land acknowledgements are just a beginning for respectfully recognizing Dakota people's history on this land and their sovereignty, the IAS is actively revising our statement to concretely outline our commitment to working with tribal nations to affirm tribal sovereignty, reckon with a painful past, and counter historical and contemporary injustices. The IAS is also committed to denouncing state-sponsored violence and racism. We also stand in solidarity with families and loved ones of Daunte Wright, George Floyd, Jamar Clark, and Philando Castile, who were all killed by police violence in Minnesota. We are committed to working alongside our relatives to dismantle the systems that seek to do harm, to sharing power, and to building a just university together. Since 2018, the Institute for Advanced Study has partnered with USpatial, the university libraries Dash and Lattice, to present Thinking Spatially. The event has taken place in many different forms, but has always sought to emphasize an interdisciplinary approach to explore the spatial context of chosen themes. This year, we wanted to explore a wider range of cartographic languages. Ever since the 2020 publication of the Land Grab Universities project by High Country News, the first ever analysis of the 1862 Morrill Act, written from an Indigenous perspective, we have been eager to feature Indigenous approaches to mapping on our stage. Across the university system, there are countless collaborations and people doing this work. Beyond the university, the work is staggering. We explored projects related to language revitalization, such as those resurrecting Indigenous place names. We also explored the role maps have played in the establishment of land-grab universities like this one through the dispossession of hundreds of Indigenous nations across the United States. Ultimately, we had to find a way to make this conversation fit a mere 3 hours, so thank you for joining us. We were honored that Margaret Pierce, the cartographer behind the Land Grab Universities project, agreed to join us today. And if you weren't able to hear her speak last night about the project more broadly, it was a really wonderful conversation, so I invite you to take a look at it. We actually record all our events, so you can take a look at it. We also immediately knew we needed to invite Marlena Myles, a Dakota artist based locally whose work we have long admired. Her Dakota Land Maps work to tell the past, present, and future of Dakota people and language. We also knew we wanted to involve our colleagues from the Truth Project, who are doing incredible work to research and give 11 tribal nations the opportunity to tell, in their own words, the history of the relations between their tribal nations and the University of Minnesota. Thank you to Anne Garagiola and Adriana Goodwin for joining us, and thank you also to Kyle Malone, who with several colleagues created the storymap towards recognition and university tribal healing, a strategic analysis of the Morrill land grab in Minnesota. We are honored and humbled to feature today's guests and are grateful for them for sharing the time and space with us today. So please join me in welcoming them all. Of course, events like this would not be possible without the support of our presenting partners. Thinking Spatially is annually presented by the Institute for Advanced Study, USpatial, the University of Libraries, and Dash. This year, our partners also include the Center for Pre-Modern Studies, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs and Resilient Communities Project, the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society, the Department of History, the Malone Environmental Stewardship Place and Community Initiative, and the Eastside Freedom Library. We are also pleased to say that today's symposium is being live streamed at NACIS, the North American Cartographic Information Society's annual conference, which is taking place just across the river in the depot in Minneapolis. Before we get much further into the program, I want to offer a few technical instructions for our audience members who are observing us online. We do have a captioner working with us today, We recommend that online attendees view captions by clicking the stream text link shared via the chat. We will also be using Slido to facilitate our audience Q&A today. So we will have time for Q&A following Marlena Myles' presentation, as well as following the conversation at 10:40 a.m. Please use your smartphone and either scan the QR code displayed on screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code MAPS. Questions do have a 160 character limit. You can submit your questions anonymously or add your name. And please know that we do anticipate receiving many more questions that we can answer. In order to respond to as many questions as possible, we also may occasionally combine related questions so that we can touch base with as many people as possible. We are also using Slido to facilitate our map giveaway. Go to Slido to enter or to win a copy of one of Marlena Myles' Dakota Land Maps. We will select and contact the winner following the event to arrange pickup or delivery. And now, without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter. Marlena Myles is a self-taught Native American Spirit Lake Dakota Mohegan Muskogee artist located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Her art brings modernity to Indigenous history, languages, and oral traditions while using the land as a teacher. Growing up on her traditional Dakota homelands here in the Twin Cities, she enjoys using her artwork to teach Minnesotans of all backgrounds and the Indigenous history of this place we call home. Her professional work includes children's books, augmented reality, murals, fabrics, animations, and has shown her work in fine art galleries such as the Minneapolis Institute of the Art, the Museum of Russian Art, Red Cloud Heritage Center, and the Minneapolis Museum of American Art, just to name a few. Her first permanent site-specific augmented reality public art installation, known as the Dakota Spirit Walk, is available on Revela AR app. In 2021, she opened her own Dakota publishing company called, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Wiyun Kihipi, We Are Capable Productions, to create a platform that educates and honors the culture, language, and history of Dakota people. So thank you, Marlena, for joining us today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marlena Myles. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I grew up in Minneapolis in a neighborhood called Little Earth, which is like a native urban community. And I went to school at Four Winds, which is an American Indian or Native American magnet school in the 90s. And outside of those two areas, I never really saw anything in the Twin Cities that showed that this was Dakota homelands. Even though I grew up really connected to my culture, I felt like once I left those safe spaces, I didn't see anything that showed, that people here were learning about the history of this land. And so as an adult, I was always good at art, but I wanted to find a purpose and a way that, I could help my community through art. And so creating the Dakota Land Maps have been a great vehicle for me as an artist to accomplish those goals. This is one of them I created at the Twin Cities. A lot of the places here in the Twin Cities or in Minnesota even do have Dakota names or historical names associated with the villages that were there or the sacredness of those places. And some of them have been replaced by European names. And so this map allows people to see that our villages, our sacred sites that have existed for thousands of years are all connected by the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers, which are, the Minnesota Wakpa and Wakpatonka. And it shows the past and also shows modern places in Dakota because, I want people to see that we exist as modern people and that our culture, our villages that used to exist, that history can be taught, but we can be seen as modern people as well. And so looking at this map, I think it has sort of opened my eyes to the bigger picture and the stories that I can tell using my art and using public art actually, because I feel like Native art, we have a responsibility to the community. And also when I study this map myself, I see the very diverse concepts and stories that are layered upon the land, because we didn't have a written language before Europeans came, and so I see the natural world around us as storing our data or storing those histories as if you would in a library, or as if your computer would store data. And so if I look at a bluff or a tree, or look at the way the seasons are changing, you know, I know the stories that have always connected to my people, to the natural world around us. And this is the second map I've created of Winona, Minnesota, Prairie Island, and Red Wing, Minnesota. And I'm expanding these maps to the southeast Minnesota next, because I have an artist residency at St. Peter and at Gustavus College there. And so I will be, you know, telling more of these stories. And I think to a lot of schools, a lot of like white institutions, they're working on land acknowledgement, and that's great that they're doing that. And, you know, Native people that go there will be visible for a little bit, but I feel like land acknowledgements are not told from like a way a Dakota person would do it, whereas if we acknowledge the land, we give thanks to the earth as a relative. And so, you know, I think having these maps around will allow people to see our stories or our land acknowledgement in a wider view, as well as in context to these sacred sites that we didn't just exist tragically, that our history is very, very, very ancient, and it's also very present as well. The kind of art I create is digital, and it allows me to share this information in many different outputs, I guess. Maybe some people don't think of Native people as contemporary people, or they think of us as just having one kind of art form, but we've always been innovative people. So anytime we had a new material or new resource, we always accepted it into our cultures and adapted it to tell our story. So I feel like I'm just continuing the tradition of innovation that I feel Native people across this continent have and still have. And a lot of this teachings, I feel, is still traditional. It's still done in a traditional sense, that the land is still our teacher, it is still an educator, and being able to immerse people will help people have a more respect-based worldview versus a resource or consumer like real worldview that people have these days. And I think the maps are just the beginning of a way to place people into a new mindset. Before 1851, before the treaties were made, when the first Europeans came to Minnesota, when they met Dakota people, you know, they strove to understand our culture. They would marry into our tribe, or they would undergo the hunka ceremony to be adopted in, because Dakota people, then we lived in a society where we didn't trade for just to benefit ourselves financially in some sense. It's to create relatives. That's the foundation of the Dakota culture, and it's what being Dakota means, is kinship, to make relatives. And so for those people who are outsiders, for them to trade with us, they had to be welcomed into Dakota culture, and those were two methods for them to become our relatives. And after the treaties, you know, people didn't have to put that kind of effort into understanding what being Dakota is, or to join our society on our homelands. And so I think, you know, it's been over 170 years since those treaties, and I'm working still to bring people into our culture and be able to understand it. And so one way is through augmented reality, and that creates artwork at site-specific places, and it allows me to share what I see as a Dakota person with everybody, so they can see the world through Dakota people's eyes, and it immerses them in that space. So when we say something is sacred, they can kind of understand more what that means, and more of the stories and the data that is stored on the land. So I have a site called DakotaLandMap.com, where I've started to take my maps and make them into augmented reality, so people can click labels and like see a 3D form of the map, and they can hear the pronunciation and see my artwork and sort of have the world in their hand, I guess, using this technology. This is sort of how I created my next project, big project, which is Dakota Spirit Walk at the Burial Mounds Park, or the Bruce Bento Nature Sanctuary. And so this is just sort of demoing how the 3D shapes in augmented reality. Some people really don't know what that means, but a popular use of augmented reality has been in the Pokemon Go games. And so this kind of creates that sort of accessibility through technology that, young people are already aware of, and it lets them see Dakota people in a modern light. And this is more of that actual Dakota Spirit Walk, where they meet 4 spirits, and these 4 spirits teach them about the land. They meet Uchimaka, who is Grandmother Earth. They meet Grandfather Stone, Ian. They meet Uktehi, the underwater serpent, and they meet Wakian, the thunder being. And each of these spirits teach us about our relationships to the natural world, because our understanding and how we relate to the natural world, that builds our understandings, beliefs, and attitudes. A lot of people today don't have much of a connection to the natural world. If I go into classrooms, I can ask, people, name 20 brands in a gas station. It's really easy for people to do that. If I ask people to name 5 plants outside, they can't do that. All these stores, all these brands, they spend millions of dollars to fill our brains with nonsense about what they're selling us, versus nature doesn't have millions of dollars to spend. So we have to really try as human beings to have a good relationship. And my art, I feel helps people connect in a fun way and sort of immerse themselves using that technology, and hopefully change the way they see it. And you can see here, some of my friends have visited, and their children and themselves. You get to take selfies, you get to have fun with it the same way we do with everything these days. So I feel like it's a good way to make Dakota culture accessible and fun at the same time, and also share our languages, our worldviews, and open up conversations to such things like as land rights and land protection, because augmented reality allows me to create art without needing to ask permission to put it on that land, because Dakota people, I think we own about 0.01% of our original home base here in Minnesota. So a lot of our sacred sites are not in our ownership as we see it in today's world. And so augmented reality allows me to sort of bypass that and tell it from my perspective. I don't have to have my way of thinking edited by another institution. Like if I worked at the Minnesota Historical Society, I'd have to go through their white editors and have them change things to match the programming they use. And I don't necessarily agree with the way they teach about our culture, so I don't want to have to collaborate in that sense, because I always feel like we're always at a disadvantage as Native people working in institutions in that manner. Just as long as you go back with our interactions with Europeans, going back to treaties, we're always being taken advantage of. And so my next project, on Sunday, I'm talking about this at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, but it's the Dakota Sacred Hoop Walk. And this one also further expands on the spiritual relationship we have with the natural world. And the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, they're already doing a lot of this work of teaching our relationships to plants and to the cycle of the year when it comes to plants. And so I feel like it's a good place to put Dakota knowledge and have them sort of promote and validate each other's different ways of thinking or working with the natural world. At the Bruce Bento Nature Sanctuary, they're restoring that landscape and placing in the Wakan Teepee Center, which is a Dakota sort of educational center going forward into the future. So I feel like these are ways to reconcile and allow people to understand our cultures the landscape arboretum when I started working with them. You know, I said I don't want to create something that is not accessible to Native people, and I feel like the cost of entering is going to be a barrier. And so they work to make it free for Native people. And I feel that's a really good way of reconciling or creating a better future. And I really don't like the word reconciliation, because that means to have started in a good place and went to a bad place, and now you're trying to go back to a good place. But I'm not sure if we ever had a good place to start out with, you know, Native people and like the government or these institutions. So I feel like this is just a good way going forward in the future to have a better relationship with each other, and also actually honor Dakota people or honor Indigenous lands by making our teachings accessible to people and our ways of understanding, whether it's scientific, whether it's spiritual, or whether it's just very technical. I feel like all of these are very important for people to see us as Native people. And I've also created some murals that are not augmented reality, you know, that are there in place that show the past, or showed, it says Dakota homelands. Like I said, growing up, I never saw anything that really showed it outside of my neighborhood. So this, people giving me the opportunity to create murals, you know, that also opens people's eyes to Dakota people. This mural is called the Dakhóta Times. Dakhóta was a Dakota village that was at downtown St. Paul, where the Union Depot is, in that area. And this sort of reconciles the ways of, I would think, like, if Native people or Dakota people and Europeans actually understood each other, and the treaties weren't just an easy way to take what they want and not have to understand us. You know, if we actually continued, like I felt like Dakota people and Europeans and other immigrants, you know, we would have created a great future, and we wouldn't be starting now doing that. I feel like the teachings of Indigenous people, it's very important, especially with climate change. And if, you know, if other people had strove to understand the way we think and had changed earlier or accepted it into society, we wouldn't be in the situations we are now, and the troubles that will be coming forward for future generations that will, you know, inherit the way the waters have been polluted, the air has been polluted, the way that we don't take care of resources, or the way that we treat nature as a resource. And this is another mural I created called Kapemini, which is a Dakota concept of what happens below is reflected above and vice versa. So we see the Mississippi River as the Milky Way above, which is the spirit road that we travel in the afterworld. And along the Mississippi River is a lot of burial mounds in Minnesota, and we buried our ancestors near the rivers to be close to the Milky Way. And this mural I created was in Bloomington, which is near the site of burial mounds that were removed to create like the light rail and the offices that are currently there. And this happened, I think, in the 2000s, so it wasn't that long ago. And when I was creating this mural just to teach about, you know, what burial mounds are and why we build them at site-specific places, the construction company that actually removed those burial mounds, they were funding this mural. I didn't know that, and they showed up to the meeting with a bunch of papers saying they had a legal right to remove those burial mounds. And, you know, that wasn't even the conversation I was trying to have. And to me, it showed that they must have a lot of guilt about what they did. And so I'm like, if you feel that way, why don't you create spaces on your property for Native people, or, you know, work to create like a memorial park for these mounds, or build new mountains or something. Because I have worked with other land developers who put the Dakota Land Map on their site, or other land developers who have been reaching out to create murals on their location, because, you know, they understand what they do as a business, and they understand that it can be problematic. And so maybe there's ways that they can provide homes for people, or create the progress that we see around us, and also like teach about the Dakota history or the land that they're sort of disturbing. And so these are just ways that my art has been in the newspapers, and ways that I'm able to promote the work that I do, which I feel represents the Dakota community. It's not just sharing my own individual skills, which I feel is important because, like I said, as a child, I didn't see anything like this, and I want to inspire other people, to use their abilities to represent the community. And a lot of schools, they have also included this land map in their locations. The University of Minnesota has it on their campus in different buildings. The Mitchell Hamline School of Law has the biggest one that's like 10 feet by whatever. I was really amazed that they wanted something so big. And, they wrote, we've had a lot of artwork on our walls over the years, but we can't remember any one piece that students have so engaged with as yours. Between classes, it's pretty common to see a few at a time huddled around it to learn about all these places. And so I think just having the map visible on buildings and public places and public spaces, it allows people to start seeing the world through a Dakota lens, and it doesn't have to be, aggressive or passive even, it just shows it and lets people maybe see this for the first time, because I didn't learn about the Dakota hangings when I was here learning in elementary school or middle school or even high school. So I just feel like maybe people don't have this sort of education, and this map, opens their eyes to a big picture, and they sort of start seeing the places they visit every day in a new light. So thank you. I don't know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone that you can use your smartphone and either scan the QR code displayed on screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code MAPS to submit your questions. Please note that questions can be submitted anonymously, and they do have a 160-character limit. So I'm going to go ahead and while we wait for the questions to come through, maybe I'll go ahead and begin by asking the first question. Hello, okay, can you hear me? Okay. So I was really fascinated by the different media that you use for your maps, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see has, how the different reactions or interactions with the map as a watercolor print versus on the wall versus through augmented reality, sort of what those different interactions have, how they've informed your own work as you create these projects, or how you want people to interact with them depending on the media.
Yeah, I think I always see technology as a barrier for people. Not everybody can afford the best smartphone or a great computer, so I always want to make sure there's a way that people can print out this information for free, or even just view it and be accessible to it. That's the most important part of my work, is making sure as many people as possible can access it. So like the Dakota Land Map is free on my website, but the Dakota Land Map is created digitally. I created an Adobe Illustrator, and I put watercolor textures on top of it just to make it not feel so smooth, I guess, as digital art can be. Some of my other Illustrator work is very smooth, and I do enjoy the way that looks, but I felt like if it's hanging on walls in classrooms, people might like the aesthetics of a watercolor or something. So, but the augmented reality, like the pieces I create are big so that it takes up space on your phone. You can walk around it. You have to actually get up and move through it. Or placing it GPS-based is important too, because I want people to get up and go to these places and experience this art as a land-based education. And sometimes, that gets interesting. I've taken people out on the Dakota Spirit Walk at Bruce Bento, and when we reach the Wakenia station, the Thunderbeing station, a big storm cloud will come through right then. It was sunny until we get there, and we have had a downpour, and I told people, that's kind of like what it's like when you call upon the power of these places, that they might come and actually visit, and so you're going to get wet perhaps, and you just enjoy that as as a human being out in the rain, not worrying about, where's an umbrella or let me run someplace, because you're not going to make it out of that park before you get wet. So, I mean, while it's technical or while it is whatever, it also, I think, allows people to see the natural world around them in a new way. And, I know a lot of people complain about phones or kids on phones. Like, all they do is stare at it all day, want to go out and play. So I feel like this lets them go out and play and enjoy their phones at the same time.
Terrific. We have a question about if you could speak about your process for determining what you put on your maps and what not to include.
Yeah, I mean, the process is researching the past, and that comes through with different books that I've written. I like to put those books on my website too, so if people want to buy and support those authors, they can, and read in further in depth of what they've written, because my perspective isn't the only perspective as a Dakota person, so I also want to, support people who write and take the time to educate the community too, like Gwen Westerman in her book, the Minnesota Thákhočhe, and then the people who've done the Dakhóta memory map, where they've interviewed Dakota people and they talk about what these places mean to them. So I always try to let people know about these other resources, but places that I don't include, I feel like are places that haven't done a good job being a good relative with Dakota people, like. And the Twin Cities ones, I have like the Minnesota Institute of Art, because they've done a lot in their galleries to modernize the way people look at labels, or they have Dakota sayings throughout their museums on their labeling. And, I feel like they do a good job of making sure that Dakota people have a space on that museum that's on our own homelands. But there's places like the Walker, which have made like the scaffold, which was recreating the place where Dakota people were hanging in Mankato. I felt like that was so disrespectful. I don't want them on my map. And, at the same time, they had an exhibition of Jimmy Durham, who is a man who claims to be Cherokee, and people have read through his ancestry tree and have seen that, he's not from that tribe. He's not Native American at all. And he takes our traumas and, he makes himself rich as an artist, as a white man, and so they had those same things going on at the same time, and I just felt like they have a long way to go before I want to include them on something like my land map. But that's probably the only place that, I wouldn't include unless I actually seen them do work. But most places I just think of, as someone who lived here in the Twin Cities, who grew up here, like what places do I think are fun places to go, and how do I include that in the Dakota language so that, hopefully they want to put this in their building too, because they're seen as being on a map. So it can work as advertising too, because I always thought about maybe making stickers that people can add and add additional places on it or something if they're supporting Dakota people in their spaces.
We have another question about what is your favorite place to spend time to connect with nature, to open to inspiration?
I live really close to Dakhóta or Crosby Farm or Fort Snelling, I guess. And so those are kind of places I enjoy riding my bike. In St. Paul, you can actually ride your bike from like Bruce Bento at the burial mounds through the bike paths around. You can go through Crosby Farm, you can go to Hidden Falls, you can go to Minnehaha Falls, you can go to Fort Snelling. You can loop around all these places along the river still. They're still public places, and so that's like one of the reasons why on like the DakotaLandMap.com, the augmented reality project I'm creating there, kind of connects all those places. Because I do feel like people pass by them all the time on bikes, and it kind of gives them a different way to experience the paths they may already been taking their whole lives, and they're like, oh, I know everything about it, and then they see this and they're like, oh wait, I guess there's a lot more for me to learn. So I want to open people's eyes to, new information and new stories that maybe they just weren't connected to or weren't told.
Thank you. We have another question about mapping place names. So did mapping place names change your relationship to place names?
Yeah, I mean, it has. It definitely has. I've seen things like Pike Island, the guy who made the treaty at Dakhóta, you kind of see how they erased our connection by putting his name there instead of keeping the name. Badote. And so when I talk about these places like St. Anthony Falls, I'll call it Wamni instead. And with the restaurant being there, I think that makes it easier for people to know what you're talking about. And a lot of people were upset when Lake Calhoun was restored to Bede-Makaska, and that's just a part of the process of renaming these places. But I think if you make them common places enough that people hear it enough, that maybe for the first time hearing Bede-Makaska was really jarring to people to know that there's a history here, and so they reacted negatively. And I just feel like, making these other names more common too, maybe in the future will make it easier to restore those names back to original places. But there always has to be a starting point, where the Band-Aid gets ripped off and we really actually start to heal rather than pretend everything's great in Minnesota.
Yeah, definitely. We have another question about, it says, I think many people are drawn to your Dakota Land Maps because they conceptualize space so differently than Western maps. And this is a great question because we're thinking about, cartography as a language, right? And how to decolonize that language. So can you talk more about scale and design? And I'd like to also add is, thinking about how we decolonize mapping practices.
Yeah, like I was saying, with the land has a lot of layered concepts stored into it. The river isn't just a place to drink water, it is a place that we used as a highway, but it's also a place that connects us to the spiritual world. And I think using these maps kind of can teach those things, can put, what honoring the water means in context. It can also, I think, put in a way that people can relate in a new way, not just say this is the old name, or it lets people who have different stories to me, they can use this map and tell their own stories from it. But I think I don't want to put everything exactly to scale, like using Google Maps or something. I'm trying to fit it into a square, honestly, for it looks good on Instagram. So some things are not going to be exactly in the way they are, like the distance-wise. There's going to be no map distance. It's like the Dakota people, they would say, it's 4 days travel to get from here to here. And they were never like, it's 351 miles from here to there. Like, it was never that exact. They would tell you along the way which places to stop. Like, in a day's journey, you would make it to this place. And then if you left at so-and-so, you would make it to this place. That's another good camping place. And so, like, one of the first maps, ever, like native maps ever created was out on the East Coast. And the native person they asked, he told them every tribe they would interact with and when they would hit the river and the tribes that would do that. So he knew most of the continent just from memory and knowing how long it would take to meet the next tribe. And so I think thinking about the land in prominent places, whether that's human-made or natural-based, is more important to me than having it like accurate distance-wise. And being an artist, I want to create things that are visually like iconic, like the icons and stuff that people can relate to and just see it as more, fun and visually attractive to people.
We have one last question. And so the question is, what are the next projects you want to do?
I want to create a coloring book of the Twin Cities that kind of makes these even more accessible, not just through augmented reality or through the maps, but, they'd have the map in it and they can start seeing each park kind of has something to it, or neighborhood has something to it that either has historical places or modern places, like a young native kid on one of the scooters you can rent down at a Wamni, something fun that shows us living in the present. Because even me as a Dakota person, a lot of like resources or Dakota language materials show us living in teepees. And while it's good to learn all of those traditional things, I also want people to see that they're able to exist as Native people in the contemporary world. So that's probably one of my next projects besides the augmented reality projects.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and for sharing your beautiful maps with us today. We are actually just let's give Marlena a warm thank you. And we just ask for a few minutes so that we can actually do a technology transition for our next speaker. So thank you. And I'd like to remind people that Marlena did bring maps, and she will be outside with her maps, so that you can purchase them, and you can also download them for free from her website.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Kyle Malone. Kyle is a program evaluation specialist with the Office of the Legislative Auditor for the state of Minnesota. He received a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Minnesota with a focus on housing and community development. He spent nearly 2 years as a research specialist for the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, known as CURA, where he specialized in providing data analysis and digital mapping assistance to government agencies and nonprofit organizations. He is proud of his work on the Truth Project and other initiatives designed to meaningfully improve the quality of life for Minnesotans and advance racial justice across the state. We will be holding all questions for Kyle's presentation and the Truth Story Map until after the panel later this morning, because he will be part of that panel, and so it would also allow us to take a small break. So let's please join me in welcoming Kyle.
Good morning. Oh, I gotta say, before I get started, that last presentation was really cool. I remember we were trying to figure out scheduling and who would go first or second. I was like, if I go second, I have to go after Marlena. And they're like, no, you'll do great. And I was like, oh, okay. So unlike Marlena, I'm not good at art, but I am good with numbers. So this is a project that I was part of. It was a strategic analysis of the Morrill land grab in Minnesota. And I was part of a team of a few researchers who were trying to understand more what role the Morrill Act and the Morrill lands played in the history of the University of Minnesota. And a lot of this emerged, of course, from the work on the High Country News report, which is where I ended up pulling most of my data as well. And I ended up creating this story map as part of that. So for those of you who perhaps aren't as familiar with it, the Morrill Act was signed into law in 1862 by President Lincoln, and in my opinion is probably one of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history. It effectively created the modern university system, whereas you had previously it was reserved for upper classes, it was a liberal arts education. These land grant institutions were designed to provide modern mechanical arts and agricultural sciences, and sort of moved the nation along as it industrialized and modernized. And so to that end, the United States government awarded, you heard some of these numbers earlier, but more than about 10.7 million acres through 162 land cessions from tribal nations. Those backed by the use or threat of violence. And in turn, those 52 land grant institutions who received them raised over $17 million for the endowments. And in exchange, they received a whopping $400,000. So pennies on the dollar. So this project I was part of, it had a few questions, and really the heart of it was trying to understand what are these lands worth to the university? How did they benefit from them? How do they continue to benefit? And so my particular aspect of the research and the story map focuses on two of these questions, which is, what is the University of Minnesota's land grab in dollars and cents? What is that for from, these Dakota and Ojibwe tribes who were forced to sign over their lands? Can we put a dollar amount on it? And of course, baked into there is an assumption that a very Euro-American assumption that you can put dollars and cents on a piece of land. And perhaps you object to that a bit. I would agree with you. There's things that, of course, this project couldn't do. It couldn't price. You can't price the loss of a homeland. Marlena talked about, that for people without a written language, the land is like their library. So how do you price the loss of your history? And the answer is you can't. But our contemporary institutions, with them, as the saying goes, money talks. And so this was sort of a way to challenge them and say, look, you didn't just get some land a long time ago and make a few bucks off it. So we really wanted to challenge, administrators and the folks in charge to acknowledge that this was, you raised a whole lot of money off these lands. And so getting into then some of the results, the University of Minnesota received over 94,000 acres of land through the Morrill Act. Most of that came through the Treaty of 1851. Most of those lands were on with the Dakota, and the remainder came from the Treaty of 1847. These, of course, are not all the university lands. They were even all the land grant lands. These are just specific to the Morrill Act. So if it looks like I'm missing some, there are a whole lot of layers to this. So one of these things I built on the side was actually a map here that lets you swipe from side to side. And if you see here, you can see all these little blue parcels are grants that the university received through the Morrill Act, and I've overlaid them on the boundaries of these treaties of 1851, and 1847. And so you can click on them, and read the signatories, and I did my best to try to trace the modern day tribal nations that can trace their foundation, or at least some of their ancestry, back to the original signatories, which of course is a very difficult task, and I don't doubt that this list is incomplete. But you can also, if you drag this feature, you can actually see that these are some of the modern day reservation and off-reservation lands of those descendant nations. And if you're curious, you can zoom way in and investigate these individual parcels. So you want to know how big it was. 160 acres. They raised almost $1,000. The U.S. paid $3.78, which is a return of 259 times on it. And this is a theme you'll see throughout it. These returns are really incredible. And now if we get into some of the more aggregate numbers, so through the sale of these lands that the University of Minnesota was able to raise about $579,000 in nominal terms. If you try to adjust that for inflation in 2021, that works out to about $18.4 million. Of course, there are some assumptions there about what year you used as a baseline, what index you use. So you could get a range depending on what assumptions you make, but you're talking, maybe it's $15 million, maybe it's $21 million. It's a heck of a lot of money, no matter how you choose to measure it. And so the vast majority of these, again, came from the 1851 treaty lands. Sorry about that. Let me just zoom out a bit here. So you can see the vast majority of those lands, those parcels that the university was granted, were on 1851 treaty lands. But it wasn't just the University of Minnesota that benefited. 32 other land-grant colleges received land in the state through the form of scrip, so basically credit to then sell the land, that then they could use that money for their endowments. In fact, 4 institutions actually received more land in Minnesota than the University of Minnesota. Ohio State, Penn State, and then the 2 Kentucky universities had joint ownership and split the revenues. So you can see some of those numbers on the right. You can see there's a really large range in which universities received what. And in fact, I discovered my undergraduate institution, North Carolina State, another land-grant college, received scrip lands in the state of Minnesota. So if you then going through this, some more numbers, they raised about $917,000. Again, depending on assumptions you make, that works out to about $18.7 million in inflation adjusted. In addition to the 2 treaties above, these lands were part of 4 other treaties signed with the Ojibwe. And again, you probably couldn't tell, but you can click on these and actually go and look at the land cessions themselves. You can actually read the text of the treaty itself. So you can see this was pretty more evenly split as far as the value of these lands to these different universities. Cornell, of those, actually was made out really well. They were able to raise more than $6 million when you adjust for inflation through the sale of their scrip, which is actually 1/3. So of those 32, one of them raised basically 1/3 of that value. And then 2 other universities, Penn State and the University of Illinois, raised more than $1 million. Contrast that, 14 schools actually were raised less than $250,000 from their lands. And that gets into how different universities approached it. Some of them just offloaded this immediately. They got these lands, they turned around, dumped them, and that was it. And some of the others held on to them, speculated, tried to maximize their returns. And so this other map I built actually shows you all the parcels for all these other different universities. And you can see I highlighted just the biggest beneficiaries in colors because there would be 32 different colors on this map if I made a unique one for each. So again, you can click on these and see, how much they raised for their endowment. Again, what the U.S. paid and the return on it. And so I highlighted this one down here over in the town of Wells. And for any Minnesotans with a keen eye might have noticed right at the very beginning that the picture at the top is actually from downtown Wells, Minnesota, in the southern part of the state. And the reason I did that is because the vast majority of their town, you can't tell, the grid's a bit obscured here, the vast majority of the town is actually built on scrip lands that were used to raise endowments for Massachusetts. So you can see that the vast majority of the towns, and so I wanted to highlight sort of one example of that. You can actually then see the records. So here's the land patent for part of was now the town of Wells here. And you can see here an example. This is what it looked like. This was again in line with the Act of Congress 1862, the Morrill Act. The scrip number, for the state of Massachusetts, and then was signed by that state to Clark W. Thompson, who, if it's the same one I'm thinking of, was actually a legislator in both the territorial legislature and then in the state Senate after Minnesota became a state. And so I just wanted to highlight that because there were a whole lot of these records. Now, what you won't find actually, looking into this, are patents for the University of Minnesota, and that's because they actually, the lands, except for maybe a few parcels, the lands weren't patented the same way they were for the other out-of-state universities. And this gets into the bit of the strategic part of it, is how was the university able to raise so much money compared to all the other schools, some of which received more land in the state of Minnesota. And that's because they were very strategic about it. So they basically got their pick of land in the state that wasn't already claimed. They got to assemble a list, which the Minnesota Historical Society, I believe, maintains on microfilm, the state selection lists for these different land grants. And I don't have a picture of those, but they would have looked, I suspect, something kind of like this. So this was not for the Morrill Act. This was for something else, a different land grant, I believe. Not sure, but it would have looked something like this. They would have had, listed all the different parcels that they wanted. I'm not actually sure what the key is here on the right, but they would have listed the parcels, the acreage, and if you look at this, in this case, for this example, they go into detail about, what are on these, they're identifying what are the resources, what kind of lumber, minerals, all that. So they're being very deliberate in selecting what will end up being the most lucrative land to then turn around and sell, or in some cases, leased. None of the Morrill Act lands, are still in the university's possession. They don't maintain any ownership or leases on them, but subsequent land grants, they do still lease out those lands for mineral extraction. But that's I think something I wanted to highlight. The strategic nature of this is they didn't just draw parcels out of a hat. They were very deliberate in identifying those that were going to maximize returns. And you can see that, the University of Minnesota made 250 times that amount. In the Treaty of 1851, the U.S. government paid the Dakota $2,300, which works out to 2 cents per acre. The University of Minnesota raised, in nominal terms, 250 times that amount. Cornell is the only other institution that managed to get over 100. But still, any normal investment, if you told you the return would return 40 times, that would be outrageous. And you would question the legality of what you were signing up for, I think. But in this case, it was all sanctioned by the U.S. government and by the treaties that they forced the Dakota and others to sign. And that is really the conclusion of the data I have and what I wanted to share. So that's sort of a look at the Morrill Act, an analysis. There's much more, I think, to do. If you really wanted to get into the archives, if anyone's looking for a winter hobby, you can get into the archives and look for all these selection lists. If you're curious just how they were thinking about it. Otherwise, this map is linked to from the Truth website, so you can go on there. You can play around with it yourself. You can click on these different parcels, see who owned it, how much they raised, and just get to know a bit more about just how lucrative these treaties were for the University of Minnesota and other institutions. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Kyle. As someone who also has done work chasing money, I know what a challenge this was, and it's really amazing what you've been able to do to put it in a fashion that's accessible to all of us through the maps and just through the website itself. So I just want to thank Kyle again, and we will now be moving to a 20-minute break and reconvene at 10:40. In the meantime, I hope you'll take the opportunity to go to the atrium and enjoy some coffee, and also check out the Y Canoes exhibit, and take a look also at the maps that Marlena Myles has brought with her, and so you can purchase one if you would like. In addition, please don't forget to enter our giveaway, which you can do via Slido. To do so, visit slido.com and enter the code MAPS. And we'll see you back in 20 minutes for the panel conversation between Margaret Pierce, Anne Gargiola, and Adriana Goodwin, and Kyle Malone. Thank you.
Wow, that's so exciting. I'm so glad to hear that. Actually, my supervisor, I don't know if you know Matt Furness. She started the Film Museum, and then she's also like taught science in like grade school and high school before that. And she's also taught animation. But she knows she does a lot of graduate programming where I work, and she wants to do something with a tree project. I think with some workshops. So I think I'll visit in spring semester. Yeah, because your lineup going already. I'm sure.
Yeah, like it's already almost spring semester anyways, like it's like past midterms now, it's like already like, you know what I mean, yeah, because we're gonna be doing something, with, I don't even know, something.
Yeah.
The MLK program, youth, and so we're gonna do one presentation for sure with all of like the first year classes, so it's like 400 students
cool.
in like this really big auditorium.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so we're starting to like go that way. But
That's awesome.
more presentations, but then workshops. Okay,
coffee
yes.
situation.
Bonjour. Nice to meet you. Yeah, you're good. Just like hug you. Okay, cool. Because sometimes, I think I just kind of too formal.
So you said you started to do that, did you do that?
Cool. So where are you going to meet Bridge?
I have a different mechanism for how we
Yes, I have, we have, I have my, I like to carry my medicine with me and, especially when I'm presenting and stuff like that. Yeah. And I usually like to have cedar in my shoes too. Yeah, just as like when you're, out there doing work, and not sometimes the chocolate and so I just do that. Cool, so where are you coming from then? Whereabouts are you located?
Michigan, we're online.
Okay, yeah, I kind of heard also construction history, so I listened to a little bit of the presentation yesterday. So you have Maine, wow, where is there? It's pretty, is it similar to us then? They have blueberries there, huh? Yeah, okay, do they have maple trees? Do they have maple trees too?
We also hired
Increasing, okay, cool, so it's pretty similar then.
Well, it has been more recently, honestly. As it warms.
Yeah.
He just finished the history of the Sioux.
Oh, so have you been in that one for a long time?
Bringing it back to the river,
Oh, okay.
protecting the river.
Oh, okay, so you're kind of all over.
So,
Yeah, that's cool. I
so that
grew up
book
up
you
north,
co-edited,
so
that
Bemidji
block
is
is
like 4 hours
also-
north of here. I like how Marlena
I've been
talked
to
about,
Bemidji.
yeah, I like how she talked about
Our history,
200
Our history is the future.
versus like 3 or 4 days.
And it
I
really
really
situates
like that concept and, yeah, and then I
relation.
moved here. Yeah, grew up in Bemidji, yeah. My mom moved from Red Lake when before I was born, so my parents,
The military's there.
my dad lived here he was all
Very
over
much so
actually,
is
my
the
dad was, and
Army Corps.
my mom grew up in Red Lake on the
Which is also-
reservation, and they got married,
So,
started having
but
kids.
he's here
and
now,
they
he's
decided
really,
to move us to Bemidji.
and
For like
the
more
other thing we've
opportunity
been talking a
and
lot
just
about
kind of
is
just to,
connecting
away
that
a little bit.
you know that book, Unworthy Republic?
But we all work and commute to Red Lake, or like, we're all back home.
I'm blanking.
Yeah, I actually got brought here for my graduate degree. That's why I came to
Northern
Minneapolis.
Finance
And then it kind of
Banking
just like,
to,
did you go to Bemidji?
yeah, I went to Bemidji State, I graduated from there. And then I took like a little period of time.
so that's one of the,
And it's just kind of odd, because this project was already like started, like when I first came here, and they were like trying to recruit me. Like, cause
so
there was only like 3
big
names.
contradiction with the North.
And so we all like knew each other.
Yeah,
Like, you know
yeah.
what I mean? We all took like this tribal state relations workshop class together. And that's when they like tried to like get me out of private for you. Not really the big reconciliation, like validation and responsibility we had. And then I got brought in. And then it just kind of like took, yeah, and that's been a lot of my work for a long time.
So now when you have,
And
these,
just really excited
remember
about the
yesterday's
interconnection of all
marvelous thing
of
where
this,
she
like
shows
work that's
these
being done,
universities starting to
and like,
look at this.
emerging young leaders, like Marlena
That kind of
and all of that,
beginnings of
and,
that.
how impactful that's gonna
But
be
even,
for the younger ones that are, step into these roles
They're
and just
also-
like do
they're
so much
also-
more, you know what I mean, like those
they know
connections
that
are
that
just
gets closer and closer
just
to
get so much
their
bigger. And,
investments, both
even
slavery.
when she was talking about, how like people work on these bike paths, like their whole lives,
So I
and
think-
now they have like this opportunity to
we're
learn
gonna see
in a
more
different way,
universities
and it's like,
doing
oh, okay,
this
it's
kind
kind
of
of
stuff.
like really people,
Damage control.
just being more open to being aware of history and wanting to know,
First thing they do is.
questioning it, right, because it's been hidden and kind of like shoved into the corner all this time, but now we're in a time and space where we can talk about that. And it's not, we're not gonna get treated as harshly as we would have, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Where it was like, please question these kinds of things.
Not that it's good now, but it's for
Yeah.
everybody. Yeah, qualified.
Yeah. All right, I'm going here now.
Got it.
Yeah, see, I'm gonna try to, see, I just
Follow
get
you,
chatty,
I
yeah,
wanna-
I can chat,
Good
just
job.
talking to
Oh,
Marlena.
I'll be right there.
Okay.
mine yesterday.
Oh,
It's
great.
Fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Margaret, this is,
I'm from
Kate.
Hamlin University, which is a private university here, founded, hello, in history. Yes, wonderful to meet you, and I'm gonna stand.
Oh, thank you.
And I so admire the iCountry News work,
Oh,
Los
great,
Angeles
thank you.
work. Yeah. Absolutely amazing.
Hi.
I wanna come out and get one of Marlena's.
Yeah, I want to shop.
It's so good.
Yeah. Let's go down.
Yeah, yeah.
But Kate, check out, if you have time, check out the White Canoes exhibit. That's
Oh,
up there too.
I will, thanks, yeah,
That's our students.
that's fantastic.
a chance to have some coffee and take a break? And how, I mean, are you also going to NACES at the same time?
No.
No, okay.
No, this is Wednesday. Do you want to sit here?
No, I think you all sit there. and-
there are four of us.
Yeah. You all sit there and then I can sit here and ask, or I can stand here and ask the question. That's fine.
You stand for the whole time?
No, just for the Q&A.
Oh,
Yeah. Because you're all talking
okay,
on your own. So I'll introduce you all. You'll talk, give your presentations.
okay.
And then there'll be Q&A at the end. So I can just come and ask from here.
Wait, you're gonna moderate, right?
Yes. The Q&A.
Okay.
And not, I don't think I'm moderating your conversation.
Oh, okay.
We're just gonna talk.
Got it.
And I have questions, but,
Okay.
just as prompts, but, I'm not the only one who needs to ask the questions, like anyone.
Okay.
If you wanna like ask, any questions as we go.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure as we get to talking, I'm not gonna just draw one of them. Start. Yeah.
You're going to join us for lunch? Yes. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Thinking Spatially Symposium. I just want to remind everyone that you can use your smartphone and either scan the QR code displayed on the screen or go to www.slido.com to ask questions. And you can enter the code MAPS to submit your questions. Please note that questions can be submitted anonymously and they do have a 160 character limit. So I'm very pleased to introduce our final event for the day, a conversation between Margaret Pierce, Anne Garagiola, Adriana Goodwin, and Kyle Malone. Margaret Pierce is a citizen Potawatomi tribal member and cartographer living in Penobscot homelands in Maine. She sees cartography as a form of writing whose secrets and possibilities she devotes her life to learning. She recently collaborated with Ho-Chunk Nation and Miami Tribe to map the removals for the field museum, and with the Land Grab University's team at High Country News, which received to map land grab. Sorry, I'm skipping all these. I'll start again. She recently collaborated with Ho-Chunk Nation and Miami Tribe to map the removals for the Field Museum, and with the Land Grab University's team at High Country News to map Land Grab University moral parcel responsibilities, for which they received a George Polk Award, among others. She holds a PhD in geography and was a geography professor for 15 years, teaching courses in cartographic history, theory, and practice. Anne Garagiola is a mother of 3 and descendant of the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa. She holds an associate degree from Century College, bachelor's degrees in sociology and women's studies from Hamline University, a master of public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and is currently pursuing a PhD in American Studies, my department, here at the University of Minnesota. Her poetry, research, and activism are reflections of her lived experiences as a mixed-race Anishinaabe. Trained in creative writing and policy analysis, Anne's work is interdisciplinary, rooted in Indigenous feminisms, and in the belief that healing happens in relationality with ourselves, others, and the land. Broadly, she uses Indigenous research methods, analyses, and modes of communication via cultural literary production to interrogate how colonial policies and ideologies attempt to control, through suppression and ethnic cleansing, Indigenous histories, voices, and knowledges. Adriana Goodwin has 2 sons and is from the Red Lake Band of Ojibwe Indians. She is a 3rd-generation college student and holds an associate degree from the Leech Lake Tribal College, where she was named Student of the Year for 2014-2015. She has a bachelor's degree from Bemidji State University in Liberal Arts, with minors in political science and Indigenous studies. This year, Adriana graduates from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, earning a master's of public policy with a concentration in human rights. Before her acceptance at the Humphrey School, she worked for the Red Lake Nation and was crucial in passing of the resolution that changed the blood quantum of the 1958 base roll to 4-4. In her capacity with the tribe, she's also worked diligently to establish various COVID-19 safety protocols for the Red Lake community, along with multiple other projects. And finally, Kyle Malone is a program evaluation specialist with the Office of the Legislative Auditor of the state of Minnesota. He received a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Minnesota with a focus on housing and community development. He spent nearly 2 years as a research specialist at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, where he specialized in providing data analysis and digital mapping assistance to government agencies and nonprofit organizations. He is proud of his work on the Truth Project and the other initiatives designed to meaningfully improve the quality of life for Minnesotans and advance racial justice across the state. Please join me in welcoming them all.
Bonjour, Jayak. Welcome. We didn't talk about whether we were going to introduce ourselves individually. Shall we do that? Okay. Bonjour, Jayak. Ha. Greetings. Bonjour. Mkoskwe Indegenikas. Bodwe Wadmin Dao. Mko Ndodum. Gasko Sago Ndochpia. Mina Kadawamkeg and Data. I'm Margaret Pierce, citizen Potawatomi tribal member. I grew up on Seneca territory at Gasko Sago at the waterfall, and I now live on Penobscot territory at Kedawamkeg, the Great Landing Place. And it's a huge honor to be here at Dakhóta Thákhočhe and to be on Dakota homelands for this event. Chinikwech.
Bonjour, Anne Indigenous, Azabakoni Zayagan in Dunjaba, Imanijska in Dundadis, Withrow and Da. Hello, my name is Anne Garagiola. I'm a descendant of the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa, where my mom is an enrolled member. My family is from the Nut Lake side of the reservation. I grew up, though, born and raised on Dakota homelands in Imanijiska, or St. Paul, and I currently live in a rural area about an hour or so northeast of campus here. It's good to be here and good to be with Margaret and Adriana and Kyle and all of you today.
Bonjour everybody, Adriana Goodwin, Indigenous cause, Washku Benesi Kwe Nindigo, Mayangan Nindudem, Miskwagami, Wizagayaning, Nindunjaba, Nimin Wendam, Oma Ayayan. Greetings everybody, to everyone here in person and to everyone joining virtually. My colonized name is Adriana Goodwin. I am a citizen of the Red Lake Nation. I grew up in the Bemidji area, which is a half hour south of Red Lake. And I came here to the metropolitan area to pursue my master's in public policy. And it is really good to be here with you all today. Miigwech.
Hi, I'm Kyle. I'm a white man descended from Irish and British immigrants, so I'm going to stick to English because that is the only language I know. I was raised in North Carolina, spent almost my entire life there. Got my undergraduate degrees in history and chemical engineering. Decided I didn't want to be an engineer. There weren't a whole lot of paths available for history majors, so I decided to get out of state, moved to Minnesota to get my master's in urban planning. I'm just happy to be here again. You know, I'm no longer with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, so it was really cool to have the opportunity to come back and talk about some of the work I did there again.
All right, so to get started, I was wondering if we could start by if y'all wanted to talk about how your collaboration came to be and what your role, each of you, how you've been a part of it.
Yeah, so I can start. So the Truth Project really came about in early 2020. We were interning for Tad Johnson, who was then the first Indigenous person appointed to a senior leadership position at the university as Senior Director of American Indian and Tribal Nations Relations. And Tad has since gone on to become regent of the university. I guess really in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings, the Malone Foundation released a call for proposals for a racial justice-oriented project. And there was a team at the university who was writing in a proposal to that. And on the Truth Project, it wasn't yet the Truth Project, but through the Office of Tribal Nation Relations, we had been trying to get funding because when the Land Grant University article came out, MIAC, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, and the 11 recognized tribes of Minnesota issued a series of resolutions to the university calling on them to be better relatives to Indigenous peoples on this land. And so we had tried a few times to fund that project, to write a history, past, present, and future of university tribal relations. And we succeeded in getting in on the Mellon Just Futures project, or Minnesota Transform as it's been called now. And so through that, our grant was subawarded to the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, and then they subawarded to the 11 tribal nations that are recognized by the federal government here. And each of those tribal nations hired one of their members to write the past, present, and future of relations between the university and their community. In addition, we worked with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs and the Humphrey School to do strategic and in-depth economic analyses of not just the Morrill Act land grab, but other land grabs that the university committed. And my role in all of that was as a project manager, but also my specific research was looking into the ways that the founding regions were able to profit so much off of land dispossession and genocide.
And one really important piece of the project was the collaborative nature of it, being really mindful of centering the voices of the tribes, protecting the tribes, honoring the tribes and the stories that they wanted to share, giving and providing that space for these kind of conversations to take place. And that's something that really sets this project apart, is through that relationship building that took place. Really centering, the tribal research fellows, really centering and uplifting the fellows to provide them with the tools and resources they needed to do some of the archival research that took place. And also, beyond that, the relationships and collaborations that took place with, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, CURA. And so, like, all of these things were really, really laid a strong foundation and really starting to change the narrative because, for so long, our stories and our histories have been suppressed by colonial institutions such as the University of Minnesota. And so this project, gave us an opportunity to tell in our own words the stories that have affected and impacted our communities.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I believe I was a researcher at CURA at the time when the Truth team, approached them with these questions about the Morrill Act and the lands and what kind of money they raised, inspired by and using the data provided by the High Country News team. CURA, I won't go into spend too much time on it, but it's, this sort of, we provide a lot of, or we try to provide mapping, GIS, and some data expertise for organizations or departments who maybe don't have that in-house. They're not as familiar, but they have an idea, a project or something, and they approach us and we try to, figure out what can we provide. So my boss at CURA mentioned that there was this project coming up, the Truth team. He sent me a link to the PDF summary of what questions they had, what they were trying to answer. He's like, "Do you want to be a part of this?" And I was like, "Heck yeah, I do. This is great." It's probably was my favorite project that I got to work on in my time at CURA. Not just because I loved spending in the data and the mapping, but because I really saw its potential to really grab people. Seeing, numbers and maps certainly hold a lot of sway in our institutions. So that's sort of how I became involved with it.
Thanks. Adriana and Anna, do you want to speak more about what you were working on in the collaboration? And the maps are that public-facing piece, but then I get the sense of just this enormous amount of work in addition to the maps. And I would love to hear what you were individually doing and how you were organizing your collaboration.
So I'll start. So I was, as mentioned in my introduction, I was employed by my tribe, the Red Lake Nation, and in October of 2018, there was a presentation by Dr. William Freeman, and he presented to the Tribal Council and remade us aware of some medical research that took place on our reservation involving young children that were sick with a disease called acute glomerulonephritis. And through this research study of 1966, the University of Minnesota conducted 86 kidney biopsies. And so in 2018, we were kind of made aware of this, and that's kind of when I started, thinking about the University of Minnesota. And then I finished up my 4-year degree, and I just so happened to, get accepted into the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I actually didn't realize that the Humphrey School was a nationally recognized school, nationally ranked school, like really an amazing opportunity. And it kind of just happened. And a few months after I got accepted, I was living here in the metropolitan area. And at that time, Anne and I met on a workshop, tribal state relations workshop. And, we were messaging each other, Buju, like we knew right away that we were like Native women in this space, sharing this space together. And, she started to tell me about the Truth Project. And, they tried to recruit me then. And, I just really wasn't ready for that commitment as of yet. I was still getting adjusted to living here in the urban area. I grew up in a very small town, a lot of Native people. And then I came here, and it's so diverse and all of these things, and just like getting used to the city life. And so I wasn't ready yet. And then the next summer, then they asked again, and I was like, okay, all right, I think it's probably time now, to get involved. That's something else that I really believe in, is that, we are all meant to be here in this space and time for a reason. Just like all of us are here sharing this space, all of our life experiences brought us here to this moment. And I think, that's really important to recognize too, as well, in our work and in our journeys, that things don't just happen as a coincidence. And, so I got brought onto the project, and right away, really interested in learning more about the history. So, we as Indigenous peoples, we talk about this violence. We talk about the land theft. We talk about the genocide. We talk about the cultural erasure, that we experience and that we have experienced, since 1492, when Christopher Columbus, I don't know however you want to say that, he didn't discover anything, but anyways. And so through the Truth Project, it really gave us that opportunity to look more into those intrinsic details. And so I became a research assistant, and then shortly thereafter, I was appointed by my tribe to be the Tribal Research Fellow. And that's when I really started to look more into that history that I mentioned with this medical research, and it just kind of blew up again. And I also was a part of a Kira collaboration as part of my capstone research. And so we looked more in depth at the Permanent University Fund and the way in which the University of Minnesota has generated wealth from all of that land theft that Kyle's research really shows well in his story map. And so I've worn multiple hats in this project, and just really honored, to be able to, now be in a space to share this research. Because for so long, while we were gathering this data and gathering all of this stuff, like we just held that collectively as like a small team. And now, we're able to share this research more broadly with the community and with people that are interested in learning more, just like everyone here in this space again, and everyone who's joining virtually. And again, just can't emphasize enough that, I really truly do feel that, I'm meant to be here, meant to be on this research project with Anne, with Kyle, sharing space with everybody. And it is hard. It's not easy to know some of those finer details, to think about maps, and to think about how, during the mid-19th century, the mid-1800s, how that they use that to their advantage, the literacy advantage. And even now, today, something that I want to mention, when Kyle was showing the cursive on the screen. And so again, in 20 years, we're going to be at a point where people aren't going to be able to understand and read that cursive. And so again, colonial institutions utilizing that literacy advantage to really advance their agendas in, generating wealth, keeping that wealth, keeping those histories hidden. And so, when we're able to talk orally and be able to share these kinds of things, you know, it's more accessible. Because now, 2022, you know, we have the lowest literacy rates. We have the lowest high school graduation rates. We have the highest rates of diabetes. We have the highest rates of all of these, like, really, you know, terrible things that put, like, a weight on our community. But now, you know, we're able to, like, kind of shimmy that off. And we're shimmying it off. And we're in spaces like this, Northrop. This is a beautiful auditorium. And, you know, it feels good to indigenize it a little bit, to sit here with our medicines, and even just the way in which Margaret offered, you know, some asema to us, some tobacco, like that's so critical and important in this work.
For what it's worth, I couldn't read that cursive. I had to get help. I'd asked my partner, can you read this to me, please? So.
Yeah, so that image that Kyle actually shared, not all of it has been decipherable. We've been working with the archivists to try to figure out where those land selections came from. He presented one page of a small pamphlet that was called Original Land Selections, 1875, located in the Pillsbury files. And we think of Pillsbury as, you know, Pillsbury Doughboy, you know, bread, whatever. But Pillsbury was one of the founding regents of the University of Minnesota. So my research began in the MNHS archives, the Minnesota Historical Society, working alongside other researchers, just kind of, you know, but the goal that we had at that time was to find that first script, find that first piece of land that the university sold. I just feel very strongly about identifying that piece of land and honoring it. But while we were going through the boxes from the land office, we noticed that a lot of the names that were signing those scripts and on behalf of the university were names that are recognizable in this state. So Henry Sibley, Alexander Ramsey, Henry Rice, and along with Pillsbury and, you know, about 20 other white men were responsible for the foundation of the university. And the Morrill Act land grab wasn't the first land grab that the university did, nor was it the last. They expropriated nearly 170,000 acres over a 10-year period, beginning in 1851, when the university was opened as a territorial institution. And if we look into what was happening at that time, in 1851 there was a treaty, and two of the founding regents, Ramsey and Sibley, were both signatories on that treaty. So if we think about how maps were used as tools of genocide and expropriation, you know, Kyle kind of showed how they were strategically choosing the selections. And I guess what we were most interested in is, you know, looking further into y'all's findings, you know, why did the University of Minnesota profit so much? And so they really were able to use those surveys, such as the image that Kyle showed, that had, you know, what they would consider resources, what we would consider relatives living on that land, you know, so it was, you know, 10 acres of white pine. And then by the 1860s, you can see in the archives a shift from thinking about those as living objects to the regents corresponding with industry officials, so like the timber company, you know, saying, oh, we have this section of land with 6 million feet of lumber available. So thinking about specifically the 1851 treaty and how that was able to, Henry Sibley actually introduced legislation to get a land grab at that time. The university received 46,000 acres of land that they sold. to fund the beginning of the territorial institution. And by 1860, the university had to close due to financial mismanagement. They had squandered all of those funds. And we're looking for a new scheme to open it back up. And so there was a legislative inquest, mainly due to the land speculation that was taking place by the Board of Regents, and how that played into the financial recession of the time. And then there was an emergency board appointed, of which Pillsbury was one of 3 men. And they really pushed using their connections as politicians, as wealthy individuals, to lobby for additional land grabs to reopen the university. And that's how they came about the Morrill Act. So in the enabling act of the state, it said that they were entitled to 46,000 acres of land to fund a state university. But in the territorial act, it was for a territorial institution. So they were able to double up on that. Yeah.
And then just to add another comment to what Anne said, the first person that did the first archaeological surveys of Minnesota was affiliated with the university. And what we know now is that those first land surveys were so critical in identifying those specific parcels of land that the University of Minnesota wanted to take and to generate wealth from, and they still continue to generate a huge amount of wealth from the iron ore leases that Kyle mentioned in his presentation, and more specifically, it's about $170 million since 1880. So over the course of 140 years, the University of Minnesota has generated $170 million, not adjusted for inflation, off of these iron ore leases that were taken. And even just the way in which that they retain those mineral rights was very strategic. And so, these founding men that did this, they were very strategic, very, deliberate in the way in which that they protected the University of Minnesota, and which allowed them, to be the institution that it is today. And yeah.
Sounds like maps were critical to all of the interpretation and analysis that you were doing in the archives. And I'm wondering, was there a point at which you decided to shift to making your own and approaching Kira, or were you already doing your own mapping as you went along with the communities and together, or just to sort it out for yourself in the archive?
So the reason why we ended up contracting with Kira, and Kira actually approached us, the Truth Project, through TAD, and offered their services pro bono, of which we're very grateful, because at the time we didn't have funding for these projects. But what the story map is just a wonderful byproduct of that relationship that we built with Kira, and that Kyle had decided to make. What we were actually looking for was, a more in-depth look into that PUF, into the Permanent University Fund, only because we knew the ways that Indigenous epistemologies are devalued by higher education, and that we would also have to speak in university language and dollars and cents, in addition to our oral histories.
And I know for me, I'm a history buff. I love archives. I love leafing through old pieces of paper. I could read all day long. But as we think of, in a more modern day context, and, how fast people want to get their information. And so that's why, story maps are so important in that, because you can have so much information and it's easy to digest. It's easy for people to understand. in a way that is visual. And it also challenges as well, even just like some of those academics, right? Like, it's just more visually appealing, and that's why it's so important too, the work that Marlena Myles is doing, you know, with all of her visuals, just because it provides that opportunity for everybody to understand. And again, you know, it's fast information. It sparks another thought. You know, it provides you an opportunity to see things in a different way that not many people have even thought of.
Did you want to add to that about maps?
Well, I didn't really know what they were doing before I showed up, so this was news to me. That's interesting.
It's like a way of being heard in a different way, maybe, with the land at the center. At the center, and hearing those names of Sibley and Pillsbury connected to what is being seen on the land, what's being learned about the land, maybe.
And another thing too, just really quick, wanting to mention is that, you know, they talk about the land, they talked about those trees, but it's so much deeper, that connection. Like even as I'm sitting here right now, I'm holding a rock that I found at the Indian Mounds in Hudson. You know, and bring sage, I bring sweetgrass, you know, we have the tobacco. Like there's such an intrinsic connection to, you know, the plants, into the medicine, into all of those things. And so when, you know, the founding regents, you know, discussed the land, there was a disruption in that connection. There was such a severe disruption in that connection. And, you know, as we think about the past, the present, and the future, so that's also how we're disconnected from the past, is because we don't have that connection the same way, and we're now, you know, regaining that back. And it's just so important to understand, you know, that it is sacred, that it is a deeper connection to the world around us. And, you know, again, these maps, and particularly Marlena's maps, you know, show that visually, aesthetically. And, you know, it's just really cool that, you know, she was able to present. And I was just so inspired by it, honestly. Like, just so inspired by her positive messages, and just so inspired by, you know, what happens when spaces like this are created, when people, you know, like us can come in and present on this research, and to, you know, share the good work that so many of us are doing, to uplift our communities, to educate our communities about these, about this history. And yeah.
Yeah. What can I ask? What the response of the university has been so far? I know there's a lot that's underway. But before we get to that, maybe there is the story map that is out there, and I'm wondering what the response has been so far, if any, or from the community.
I think our communities have been incredibly supportive. Over the course of our research, we met regularly with the tribal leaders who were, you know, always supportive of what we were doing, always very interested in the project. Institutionally, I think departments have generally been supportive. People want to learn, you know, so they can do better. We've been able to form partnerships with the Truth Project and various departments. Institutionally, I think they're just waiting, I guess, for our written report to come out. You know, universities don't like publicity. The regions don't like to talk publicly about money. So there hasn't, I guess there's just kind of a distance that's been created. And so there hasn't been formal dialogues happening, I guess. But hopefully that will change.
And I think people are shocked too, just to see the magnitude of all of this, of the wealth that was generated off of, you know, these acres of land that were forcibly taken and all of these things. And I feel like that's the response that we get a lot of time, is like that shock. It's like, wow, you know, like this is really what happened. Like this is like big. This is crazy, you know. And then even as we like look and talk more about Kyle's map, and we see all of those other big institutions that are on there, you know, Cornell, for instance, and you know, we think of these places as very highly regarded institutions, but there's so much of that history that has been suppressed so well, again, by these institutions, that they don't want to talk about this really bad history of, you know, what took place. And it is uncomfortable. But how do you think we feel, right? I'm uncomfortable every day. I'm made uncomfortable all the time, and I still just have to, you know, figure it out. And so I feel like, you know, people are shocked, but then I think that they come back around and want to learn more, like Anne said, and want to do better, want to be better relatives after knowing this information, because when we know better, we can do better, and when we have this kind of information presented to us, you know, we can do something about it. We can, you know, create space again for people like us to have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, and I think I just want to add too, right? Like I had mentioned briefly in the beginning, you know, how we found our funding sources, right? This was never an institutionally supported project. We know where institutions put their priorities by where they put their monies, and that was never behind the Truth Project. And I guess I also just want to, you know, trouble what Adriana just said a little bit, because it's not always know better, do better, right? Sometimes people know and they choose not to do better. And so I think this is a point where we recognize that and made key alliances. For instance, we held a symposium where the Tribal Research Fellows presented their findings last spring, and some of the folks we invited were from other institutions, MIT, you know, who also received stolen Dakota lands. But they had a fellow out there who was looking into this, and he came and offered support. And so, you know, just kind of putting that peer pressure on the institution and pressing them to really do better, because I think that this project's been going on for nearly 3 years now, and there's always the danger of, you know, the appropriation of Indigenous knowledges and the opportunity for the university to say, hey, we're doing this really good work, but also we want to be transparent in that we requested funding from the institution multiple times. You know, this project barely scraped the surface of the truth, and beginning to reform relationships and build trust. And I think that had it been fully funded, there would have been an opportunity to do even more of that work rather than just looking at the past.
So just thinking about, you know, my involvement has been more limited, though it's been extremely rewarding even in just that limited respect. I know I've had a couple opportunities to sort of present that map and some of the work I did, which is only one part of this larger project, but the feedback every time has been really great. A lot of people, you know, have told me that it's, I guess it shocked them at first when you see those numbers and you see it, you know, mapped out for you, and you get a sense of the magnitude. But, you know, I made that story map, and I sort of just then put it out into the world without really knowing what would become of it. I like to imagine that the people, the powers that be, have seen it, Do I think that they'll have a moment of contrition and see it and be like, oh gosh, we need to make up for these wrong? No. I don't think, I'm not that sanguine about the power of one story map, but I think its value would be, it's not just an educational tool, but it demolishes the defense of ignorance, right? Like, you show that, you see the numbers, you see it there all laid out in front of you. You can't, you can no longer defend it in the sense, in terms of, yeah, we got some land a long time ago and made a buck or two. Like, no, you didn't. You made a whole bucket load of money, and that money made money, and that money made money, and it's still making money. So I think the idea was that, that would, at least in some sense, it would, there would no longer be able to plead ignorance. That anyone, if you were going to continue to defend the status quo, you had to be honest about why you were doing it. And that's because you didn't want things to change, or you didn't want to, try to make up for that. Try to, make right some of that wrong, spend the money, basically. So it's, who knows in the long run where it'll go. I mean, one map isn't going to change the world, but I also, understand that it was also sort of, I'd hope, I'm using the language of like Euro-American cartographic tradition, reflected back on itself a little bit, I think, because mapping in that sense was instrumental to the American colonial project. You see those nice, neat little rectangles, and all on a grid laid out. And if you go out in nature, you're not going to find those lines on the ground. They were imposed on the land in order to be able to commodify it and divvy it up and sell it. And, that was, instrumental, like I said, to the expansion of the American state, particularly in the West. So in some sense, I can't help but reproduce it because that's what happened, but I hope, that in a way I was able to at least reflect it back on itself a little bit and expose it for what it actually was, which was a tool of colonization and appropriation.
Yeah, and I think Kyle brings up a really key phrase there, right? In perpetuity. So the law, the Morrill Act, stipulates that the monies raised through the sale of Morrill Act lands is held in perpetuity through the Permanent University Fund. And we know this law was influenced and supported by the University of Minnesota Regents of the time. And the university has not been transparent or forthcoming in the details surrounding how much they have made in perpetuity. But if we think about that, if they're making money in perpetuity, then what are we giving in perpetuity? And what do they have to give in perpetuity back to start to make amends? And I think this also goes back to something that Marlena mentioned. The Truth Project has never been about reconciliation. I don't think that any of us ever believed that the university started from a place that we would like to reconcile. But we see this as one small step in how the university can start to transform its practices and policies that have been in place for the last 171 years.
And then as we, think about that phrase in perpetuity, again, the way in which that, they utilized, going back to the maps again, to, identify these plots of land, it didn't just benefit here in Minnesota. It also benefited, states across the country, because what else they did with the Permanent University Fund was that they bonded the monies from that fund to various municipalities across the state of Minnesota. And so what we now know as the state of Minnesota and the infrastructure that's here, such as the hospitals and the roads, that came from the Permanent University Fund. And what Kyle was mentioning about, the money, right? And what Anne just mentioned about the money is that we don't even know that full number because they've just been able to pull from one pot of money, put it into another pot, and then back around again like 5 different times. And so for us as like researchers to even be able to pinpoint, what's going on takes an extreme level of diligence and time and effort. And, again, these colonial institutions have used that to their advantage in hiding the data in places, like even as one of our researchers on the capstone team that I had, it took him so long to find like just maps on the DNR website. Because they're just like hidden and you have to dig and dig and dig. And, that's also another way that they, use these things to their advantage. So.
Just went off and surprised me. I was just thinking also about Puff as taking from you in perpetuity. Something, Anne, you mentioned for a moment was about all the projects you could be doing because the work is just getting started. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what those, if you want to share them publicly, if you could speak to some of those projects that need to happen.
Well, some are already taking place. For example, in the Office of Native Affairs, the senior advisor to the president, Karen Diver, is leading a number of trainings related to Indigenous research that will be available online. We've also submitted a guidelines and best practices toolkit for U of M researchers. And that will be followed up by a symposium in the spring. And through that symposium, we hope to, one, teach researchers at the institution how to do research in a good way with tribal communities, but on another level, want to also offer tribes the tools to build up their own research capacity so they don't have to depend on institutions when they need to carry something out. And so they also know what their rights are in regards to data sovereignty, research practices. Yeah, so there's a couple of things moving, but I think that, the tribal research fellows all identified, in coordination and conversation with their communities, what they would like to see from the university. And so we are really looking to them, to lead those conversations and to show the university what is needed to be done to make this a better space for Indigenous peoples.
And then, even outside the University of Minnesota, there's other opportunity for other organizations to help contribute to uplifting Indigenous peoples. And so, we talked a lot about the Permanent University Fund in this conversation, and the Permanent University Fund is guided by legislation that can be changed via legislative authority. So there are specific statutes that could be changed so tribal nations can have access to some of that money that has been bonded out historically. So this year alone, the University of Minnesota is bonding out $500 million. Again, we as tribal nations aren't eligible to apply or to have access to these funds. And so there are, subtle changes that could take place, within the next session. And so that's also another area, from outside the institution, that could also be worked towards to changing it and to, rewriting this narrative, to giving some of that back to tribes and to allowing us to be able to, create projects and create business ventures and create the infrastructure that we see fit, that we know. So we know what's best for our communities, and just giving us that opportunity to be able to act and put all of these things in action would be great, because for far too long, we've had policy and all of these things that have told us what was best for us, and it really turned out not to be good for us. And so there are things and changes that could be made, swiftly to really start, rewriting this story, and to start giving back to tribal nations the way in which that we deserve to uplift our people.
Yeah, if we think about, there's been other organizations that are created by industry or institutions that have made huge profits off of Indigenous genocide and land expropriation. And so I think our work is really a challenge to the Board of Regents, asking them, how will you divert part of this revenue stream so that it goes back into our communities?
And then even more broadly too, Anne mentioned Pillsbury. Just even that history of, these Fortune 500 companies that are here in Minnesota, that has a history. And so also as organizations and, people that have this status of having money, confronting your organization's history, with land dispossession, and also with how, it really has impacted, the present day. And so, like, we mentioned Pillsbury, the Pillsbury Doughboy, so we got those things in our commodity food rations in the 1950s and the 1960s. Well, now what do we know about flour and, oil, and how those things impact our health? And, again, that was like deliberate. One of the fellows, or one of our collaborations, connections from MIT, that he came here, and that's what he shared with us, was that actually the Pillsbury Doughboy is really racist, actually. And it had to do with all of that. And so, as organizations, as people who are working in organizations, just taking that time to confront that history is really critical.
Yeah, and I think, there's been a number of ways that the institution has tried to get ahead of the Truth Report. And so one of them was they released last spring an announcement that they were going to offer a waiver for members of the 11 recognized tribes under a certain whose income was under a certain dollar amount. But when we really look at that policy, anybody who makes under 70,000 is eligible for Pell Grants, so that's not going to really help. Also, it doesn't take into consideration or really help those whose lands were expropriated. The Dakota people, the Dakota tribes who were pushed off of this land. And the reach of the regents was vast. They were involved in the dispossession of other tribes' lands too. And if we look at folks like Sibley or Steele, they come from generations. Their parents committed genocide. They committed genocide. And so we would like to see an expansion to a true waiver for all Indigenous peoples to attend both undergrad and graduate school at the University of Minnesota, regardless of where they're from. That would extend to citizens and descendants with documentation from their tribal nations. That would cover not just tuition or build fees, but would also cover the full cost of attendance, so billed and unbilled charges.
Speaking of that, that's one of the things I wanted to try to show with one of my maps, was that, after, was it 1852, the Dakota were expelled from the state of Minnesota. 62, sorry. And so, I tried to show that on my map. You can see, trying to at least track those, the modern day, at least registered tribal nations, of course, there are a lot of indigenous people who don't have federal recognition. So my effort's incomplete, but it was at least to try to show that, you know, these descendants of these people who were forced to cede their lands and then expelled from their lands live all over the country, and particularly the American West. I mean, if you zoomed out far enough, you can see, you know, you can identify these spots, you know, all over the map. And so it's, I think it's dishonest to be like, well, we can only afford to help those who are still in the state of Minnesota, or why do we owe anything to people from South Dakota? Well, because, you know, it's, you got to draw an arbitrary line on a map, and they didn't get that choice. So, yeah, if you're serious about making amends, which I'm not sure they are, but if you're serious about actually committing to that, then you have to do a full reckoning of all the harm that's been caused. You don't get to just stop at a line on a map because it feels unfair. Well,
Yeah, and that, I think that has to be a consultation that extends to each tribe individually, right? So this is work that's gonna take the university effort and trust building, but they need to work out, you know, whatever each tribe wants, you know. Natives are not monolithic peoples, and so they can't just say, okay, we're gonna give all the tribes the same amount, because some of them have lost a lot more, right? And if we think about the connections to research being done in other areas, right? Randall Aki wrote that the theft of indigenous lands results in deprivation that accumulates over generations. And he was specifically talking about the White Earth Nation up in northern Minnesota, and how land dispossession 170 years ago has continued to cause repercussions to this day, especially around housing insecurity, financial insecurity, food insecurity, access to education. And the university likes to think that they don't have a role to play, right, presently in trying to ameliorate some of those outcomes. But I think our research shows that they do, because it started with them.
And I've been dreaming. I'm a dreamer. Been dreaming for a long time. But, you know, through this project, you know, I also think that this is history that everyone should know. This is national history. And so, you know, this history should be part of a core curriculum for K through 12, in higher education, you know, just across the board. This should be history that everyone should be made aware of, because it has had national impacts. And again, tying it back to the maps, Anne and I were reading a dissertation done in the late 1980s or something like that. And what it had mentioned was that, so we know that the Mississippi River starts in further up north, and it goes all the way down to the basin. And Steele, his name was, he was one of these, again, first men that were here. They had identified that there was a 50-foot drop. And so where Owamni is today, they had identified that this was a place that could generate mass amount of power, even more so power than like places such as Massachusetts. And so again, the role of the maps and of mapping the land in that generational wealth that has since amassed. But again, you know, it's this impacts of what happened here in Minnesota has impacted nationally across, you know, what we now know as the United States of America. And, you know, we should know this history. And yeah, so hopefully one day it is a part of the core curricula at that national level. So all of our young people and all of our people, you know, can know about what actually happened here.
And continue to happen. And the tribal civics is American civics. Yeah. I'm going to do a time check for a sec here. Oh. Time check. Quick, well, what do we haven't talked about that we need to get to before we open it up?
They're checking their notes, and I'm over here just winging it.
I guess, again, just really wanting to highlight the relationship, the building of relationships between people, between organizations, and how impactful that can be in supporting this work, in uplifting this work. You know, the more that we can talk about it, the more that we can share, you know, the more ideas that can be generated and that can be created and acted upon, you know. And so I think that's also really important as, you know, all of us, you know, leave this space and continue on in our lives, you know, to continue to build relationships with one another, you know, because despite, you know, our real or perceived differences as human beings, we love and grieve in same or similar ways. And so the more that we can find connections with one another, the more that we can see one another as humans that are deserving of value and love and compassion and empathy, and you know, really starting just to love one another again. You know, I think too, there's probably not enough love in the world, but there is. You know, the same love that our grandparents had for us, you know, way before we were even born, is the same love, you know, that we have for our babies and for the ones that are still not born and are still not here yet. And you know, as Western societies, it's a lot of individualistic. It's a lot of I, me, those kinds of things. It's not we. It's not us. And you know, the more that we can see each other as part of community, as part of like this living being, you know, these things, you know, we can really start to, you know, build connection and relationship with one another, so we can love and value one another in the ways that we deserve. And I think that challenges, you know, these colonial institutions too, because again, a lot of it is I, me, and it's not we. And so if we can be a we, you know, we can accomplish so much more.
I don't have a follow-up to that. I think I got it.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Thank you very much for this really rich conversation, and just for the amazing work you're doing to hold the university accountable to tribal communities, and also to hold us accountable, to help you and support you with this project. So I'm going to be moderating the Q&A, so I just want to remind everyone that you can use your smartphone and either scan the QR code displayed on the screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code MAPS to submit your questions. Please note that the questions can be submitted anonymously and have a 160-character limit. And also just know that we're going to be receiving more questions than we could possibly answer. And so we may have to combine a few questions, and so I'm just going to be taking them from here. And so hopefully if you don't get your question answered, please, you know, feel free to afterwards to ask our panelists a question. Okay, I'm going to begin with, we have several questions here online, so I'm going to begin with the first question is around archival research and how, you know, you've conveyed how incredibly painful it was to do this research. And so the question is, how do you process this, and how can others support you in doing this work?
I think we're still processing it, to be honest. It's probably a huge part of the reason why our report still isn't out. It just is a lot to deal with. I think we found things in the archives that we weren't expecting to. You know, the reach of the university, again, is very long. And so thinking particularly of my community of Boys Fort, we found that the regions were responsible for relocating the entire tribe multiple times. But then in the 60s and 70s, the university extension also played a role in relocation processes, which was around the time that my grandmother was relocated to the Twin Cities. And so, I don't know of the exact connection there. There's a lot there's a lot of papers in the extension archives, and we don't know if that was just a one-time occurrence, or if the extension played a role in relocation programs multiple times. In addition, there was literature in those boxes that indicated that other university extension offices, particularly the University of Wisconsin, was disseminating information in the 1970s that really was gendered and directed towards Indigenous women, trying to train them on how to be good wives, on how to assimilate to white motherhood, and also literature and research showing that they thought that there was an abnormal rate of Indian childbirths happening during that time, and a desire to control that relative to the number of white births happening. And so just thinking about the roles that the university plays, and not just in the founding, right? It wasn't, this genocide didn't happen just in the founding. It continues.
And when we were, in the archives that day when we found out about the, extension program, then you start to think about like present day connections. And so what else took place after that relocation era is when we really seen a boom in violence against Native women. So now today, almost every Native woman has experienced some kind of violence in their lifetime. And so like when you're reading this history and when you're like finding out this history, it just kind of hits you. And it's like, wow, all of this, trauma and, this secondary trauma that we're experiencing, it ties back again to the University of Minnesota. And even as to far as like the blood quantum and the oppression that we as Native people have imposed on ourselves laterally, because there is that, right, with enrollment in tribal citizenship, that tying back to blood quantum. Well, blood quantum came from this institution, from the University of Minnesota with Jenks. He was an anthropologist. And he was behind, he had these ideologies about the 5 classes of man. And so white men were at the top, and brown and black men and people like us were at the bottom classes of man. And so it's very triggering to, read this history and then, think about the present day implications, because I am that person. We are those people, right? Those statistics, those harrowing statistics that we experience today, I'm not removed from that. It's very personal to me, especially when, I have to bury my loved ones every couple months, when I have to bury, my 16-year-old niece because she committed suicide. Or, when my sister committed suicide. Like all of these things are very highly personal, and so it's really triggering to be in the archives, to be in this space where all of this knowledge is stored, and we have to take breaks. You know what I mean? Like Anne hasn't been back to the archives in months because it's just that triggering, that traumatic for us. And even as I'm talking here today, I can feel myself quivering because it's real. The trauma that we experience as Native people is real, and it hurts. It hurts to know more of those intricate details of the way in which these systems have, impacted today. And and so that's why, it's so important that we come together and heal together and uplift our people, so our babies don't have to experience those same kind of violence that we still are very much experiencing today.
I would just like to say that I really admire the strength of you two and the work you're doing. You know, I can hear it just in your voices how hard it is to even talk about it. So I really admire your willingness to you know, put yourself through that in the hopes that it might pay off for, you know, others someday. Because it's not some stuff that happened to some people a long time ago for you. So, thanks.
Would you like to add anything?
No, I want to echo what Kyle is saying. Igwe, and I'm very grateful that you, that we're here together and that you're doing this work. That's really important, and it's really important for everyone to listen to what you're saying because of all the hard work behind saying these words.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for just not only doing this work, but also for sharing your own personal connection to it in ways that I know is very hard to speak from the heart in front of a large audience. And there's been a number of questions around how the university itself is still, in spite of all this work that you've done, that you've shown, in spite of acknowledging that this project is happening, that there's still moments of gross dismissiveness. And so a number of questions have popped up around the Regent's recent comments about diversity and how that reflects how this change, this kind of change is not easy. And so the question is, what can members of the UMN community do to drive change and to work in and be a good relative?
Yeah, Regents Vigum, I'm assuming, is who they're talking about. And we think about, right, there was a 40% boost in enrollment at Morris over the last year of Indigenous students, which still means less than 200, right? So if less than 200 students is making them uncomfortable, you know, it's sad. Yeah.
And I think too that, you know, racism is so deeply embedded in American society that for far too long people have been able to get away with these kind of ideologies. You know, the walleye wars that took place in Wisconsin, that wasn't that long ago. You know, they had very disparaging remarks about Native women. You know, kill an Indian, save a walleye. You know, that was just in the 1980s, 1990s. You know, like these same ideologies have just been continued to have been passed down from generation to generation. You know, even as we look more at some of the data and the statistics around reservations, like Public Law 280, the ones that are affected by Public Law 280, you know, there's very high rates of violence on those neighboring towns. You know, violence of, you know, non-Native against Native people. Even as we think about like just the response from systems, again, the violence of Native American women and, you know, the response from law enforcement, you know, that we're drunks, we deserved it, all of these things. And so it's also about challenging, you know, these stereotypes, these stigmas that are so deeply ingrained in American society. And, you know, what happened to George Floyd, you know, that's real, you know, like that's real. Like I watched that live stream that day, and that still hurts me to you know, just to recall those memories. And, you know, the people that hold the power in these systems, you know, they think like this, and, you know, it's just terrible.
Yeah, and if we think, you know, Regent Svigum's comments, you know, he's not alone in that line of thought. If we think about politics in general, especially the current election cycle, right? We have Matt Beck, who's running for lieutenant governor, and in several of his speeches, he's been extremely racist and anti-Indigenous, saying that Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan was savaging him. And when he was called out on that, he said, you know, he didn't know that that was racist. But we have to think about how these senators have, you know, for a number of years now, refused to pass Indigenous education for all, right? So they can't claim this ignorance when they're actively blocking, you know, people being able to learn about it. I think of another one of his campaign commercials where he's like awkwardly holding this baby in front of one of those child's play teepees, right? So this is like, you know, they're just embedding these anti-Indigenous colonial imageries and words into their campaigns still in this day and age.
And one more thing about, you know, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, we held an event at the Humphrey School this previous spring, and, you know, she shared with us that day that one of her colleagues, another elected official, basically told her, you know, basically made the statement, oh, you guys are still here, like insinuating that, you know, that we aren't alive, that, you know, we aren't a people. And, you know, I think that's also, you know, a big part of the conversation too, is that oftentimes, most times, we are only depicted as a people of the past. And that's, again, why the work, you know, that we're doing and the work that Marlena Myles is doing is because it's changing that narrative, because we aren't just a people of the past. You know, we have educations, we have all of these like really beautiful things, and, you know, it's just really unfortunate that people in society in general has viewed us as less than for as long as they have.
We only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to combine two questions. And so one of the questions is, has the project had interaction with the physical land parcels and other current owners that you've identified? And then also, in terms of thinking through intergenerational benefiting, did you get or benefit from scripts from Indian lands elsewhere? And so in terms of connecting communities elsewhere from outside of Minnesota. Okay.
I don't, that's one of those items that we did not just have capacity to do. Our research focused mainly on archival work and community engaged research. But that is, you know, that's another step that can be taken, is to identify who holds title on that land currently, and what are they doing to honor the land and the people who the land belongs to.
And too, like, so the research was, there's just so much, but it can be tied back. So like when we mentioned that the Steele family, that was like, what, 5 generations ago? And so like you could identify now the beneficiaries of, you know, what took place in the mid-1800s. You know, these same families that had wealth then are the same families that have wealth now. You know, that generational wealth didn't just disappear. It just, you know, continued to grow, continued to evolve. And so it's very doable to find out just exactly, you know, those benefits today, who's benefiting it from today.
As far as the second part goes, I don't believe the University of Minnesota, under the Morrill Act, received any lands outside of what is now the state of Minnesota.
All right, well, thank you so much for this really amazing, wonderful presentation and for sharing your work with us today. We look forward to hearing much more as you continue with this project, and we also look forward to hearing from you about how we can support you with this work. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank our wonderful presenters. So if you could please give them another round of applause.